Does everything look okay? Okay, excellent. So criticism is a staple of the scientific enterprise. Theories are criticized for making inaccurate predictions. Experiments are criticized for shoddy design. Inferences criticized for being less than cogent, and models for being less than plausible. But these criticisms are typically targeted at things we should accept from science. And that's by no means the only thing that happens in science. Science isn't only a game of acceptance and belief. There's other activities that happen, and today we're going to focus on pursuit in science and how you might be able to criticize scientific pursuits. Right? So this is when scientists allocate time, money, effort, or other resources toward the development of scientific ideas or tools. And we've noticed there's a bit of a gap in the philosophical literature on talking about criticisms of scientific pursuit. And so what we're hoping to do is to start a conversation about that. And by we, I mean mostly Marina DiMarco and me just sort of holding on for dear life in the wake of her brilliance. So Marina has been kind enough to let me share our ideas with you. So here's the plan for today. I'm going to start off by just motivating the need for a critical apparatus or machinery in the context of pursuit, with 3 different arenas in which I think pursuit-based criticism is important. Then I'll present our model of pursuit, which we call the Apokritic model of pursuit. We won't worry about what that funny word at the beginning of that means just yet. We'll talk about that later. But the guiding idea here, the inspiration really for the model, is that pursuits are criticizable things. Then we'll look at the 3 core concepts of the Apokritic model, which are features, bugs, and capabilities, and talk through those things and show how they feed into these 3 arenas of pursuit-based criticism that we started with. So let's begin by just getting clearer about what pursuit is. As I said, to a first approximation, it's the allocation of resources toward the development of a scientific idea or tool. Now, when you look at the literature on pursuit in the philosophy of science, there tend to be certain patterns, and we want to push back against some of those patterns. So first, there's a heavy emphasis on theories or hypotheses being the main objects of pursuit, often to the exclusion of other things. Second, there tends to be a linear view of the scientific process or scientific inquiry going on when this happens. So frequently, pursuit is sandwiched right in between the context of discovery and the context of justification. And the model is supposed to be something like this, the linear model. Scientists come up with ideas in the context of discovery, right? Then they develop those ideas in the context of pursuit. And once they've been sufficiently pursued that they're ready for showtime, they get tested in the context of justification, where they're either accepted or rejected. Now, we don't think that this is the right way to think about pursuit or about science more generally. And so our preference is not to talk so much about science being aimed at pursuing theories or exclusively theories, but rather for science to be aimed at pursuing questions. Now, of course, questions can be about theories, but they can be about a bunch of other things too. They can be about models, middle range hypotheses, measurement procedures, data, methods, pretty much any damn thing you can imagine in science. Right? And we're going to define a pursuit then as pursuing a question happens just in case some of the actions that a scientist takes have the discovery of a correct answer to that question as their goal. So for instance, if we see a scientist where their goal is something like finding a cure for cancer, then we can assume that they're pursuing the question, what's the cure for cancer, would be the rough idea behind this. Now note that this dissolves both the theory fetishism that we don't like and the linear model of inquiry that we don't like. And questions happen throughout the scientific process. And so there's going to be pursuits throughout the scientific process as a result. There's not going to be discovery, pursuit, justification in that neat order every time. Furthermore, this already maybe gives you some sense of why we need a way of criticizing pursuits, because if pursuits are permeating the entire scientific process, then of course, there's going to be lots of points in which you want to criticize what's going on there. But what we want to do now is give some slightly more concrete places where criticizing pursuits seems especially salient and important. These are what we're calling our arenas of pursuit-based criticism. So the first of these is basically in the context of funding decisions. So here we have in mind when organizations like the National Science Foundation and the European Research Council evaluate grant applications, right? Now, in such context, the number of projects, that is the number of pursuits, vastly outstrips the available funding. Criticism of these pursuits then becomes an important means for winnowing down the list of fundable projects, and indeed one might even conjecture that projects most deserving of funding should do a better job withstanding pursuit-based criticism than rival proposals. We're going to focus in particular on the National Institute of Health and the way that they evaluate grant proposals with a specific kind of concern in mind, what's called sex as a biological variable. What you can see from this little poster that we grabbed from the NIH website is that there's a bunch of different stages of inquiry or parts of the proposal where questions about sex as a biological variable pop up. And at each one of these places, you might ask certain kinds of questions. For instance, did you include sex as a biological variable in the design of your study? Did you collect sex-based data in the right sorts of ways? Did you analyze that data in the right sorts of ways? And how are you communicating it, right? And all of these can be occasions for criticism that then maybe allow the granting agency, in this case the NIH, to adjudicate between different grant proposals. So that's one place in which you can see the importance of having pursuit-based criticism. A second one is the way in which scientists shape research agendas. And this can happen on a number of different scales. So it might happen at a very small scale, for instance, when a dissertation advisor tells her advisee, hey, that's a bad question, you should work on something else, right? But it can also happen with this interesting genre of scientific document that we kind of got hooked on as a result of this project. They're sort of agenda-setting manifestos is maybe the best way to describe them, where these are sort of a call to arms in print, where they're trying to reorient the field. And they're quite varied, and you can find them in a lot of different disciplines. We'll focus on this one just as a concrete case study, where two epidemiologists are calling for what they call an epidemiology of consequence. Very roughly, they end up criticizing the way that the status quo goes about pursuing questions, which tends to be a focus on a small number of variables where you hit a high significance threshold, but you get very low effect sizes. And they're calling for investigating more complex causal structures that might give you larger effect sizes. That's basically the version of that. But when you're trying to reshape a research agenda in a field, pretty clearly you're going to have to criticize the way that questions have been pursued up until that point. Third and finally, another place where pursuit-based criticism arises, our third arena, if you will, is when scientists are public-facing, when they're being held accountable to the larger society of which they are members. And we can think of sort of the notorious cases where it's very clear that there were bad pursuits going on, like the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. We're going to look at a slightly different example, which is some debates that have been happening about neurosexism. And the headline of this, which is taken from a Nature article in 2019, gives you a sense of what neurosexism is about. That basically you try to explain patterns of observed behavior on the assumption that there are hardwired sexual differences, that is biological sexual differences, that there's essentially a male and a female brain, and this is supposed to explain stuff, right? Now, it turns out that empirically, this is just not very good science, but obviously it also has a strong moral valence to it as well, because we're concerned about reinforcing pernicious gender stereotypes, right? So this would be yet another place in which you would be criticizing a certain kind of pursuit, namely an explanatory strategy predicated on the hardwired hypothesis, as I'll be calling it today. So hopefully at this point, you're drinking the Kool-Aid, you're saying like, yeah, we do need a way of criticizing pursuits. Way to go, Khalifa. Why don't we stop and just drink beers? It's Friday, right? I'm going to try and do a little bit more than that. And I'm going to try and propose a model, right, which we call the Apokritic model of pursuit, which, as I said, takes as its inspiration that pursuits are criticizable kinds of things. That's the starting point. That's the inspiration for it. Now here I'll just take a brief digression and explain this funny word apokritic, and I was very happy to see my good friend and occasional work husband, Jared Milson, in the audience, because we stole this word from his dissertation. If you guys have a chance and are really interested in questions, it's a great dissertation. The word that we stole, apokritic, it comes from the ancient Greek word meaning to answer questions. And this gives you some hint about how we think about pursuit. Basically, the way we're going to characterize pursuit and criticisms is that criticisms happen when there's a breach of a norm in how scientists ought to answer questions. That's the guiding idea behind it. What I'm going to do now is motivate that and present the core ideas of the apocritic model before we turn to tackling some of those examples that we looked at before. So I'll start with a big philosophical question, right? What is a criticism, right? And I'm going to give you an exceedingly shallow answer to it, right? When you criticize someone, essentially what you're doing is you're saying, hey, you shouldn't have done that, right? So for example, imagine that you're a basketball player and you're double teamed, right? And you, instead of trying to pass out of the double team, right, you play hero ball and try and score a basket, and it doesn't work out very well, right? Then you can imagine someone saying like, yeah, you shouldn't have done that, right? You shouldn't have played hero ball, right? We're going to be interested in a slightly more nuanced kind of criticism, only slightly more nuanced, right? Which is what we call a contrastive criticism, where you say, you should have done this instead of that, right? So you might say, you should have passed out of the double team, right? Instead of playing hero ball would be an example of that. Now, the reason why we focus on contrastive criticisms is because they tend to be more constructive, right? What you're doing is you're not only saying you shouldn't have done that, you're saying here's a way to ameliorate your situation. And we think that this is a useful thing to focus on. And now we can start to sort of get underneath the hood of the criticisms a little bit more. And one way you might think about criticisms is deontically, that basically when you have a statement of the form, you should have done this instead of that, a contrastive criticism, what's happening is that this that you should have done should be permitted or obligated, and that you in fact did is either prohibited or minimally a dereliction of an obligation, right? Now, these words, I think, sort of end up having a sort of official sounding or perhaps moral sounding air to them. We just want to point out that norms come in lots of shapes and sizes. So it makes sense to talk about the norms of playing smart basketball, smart team basketball. And so you could then just see how there's a general norm of passing out of double teams instead of playing hero ball. And so that we want to think about norms quite capaciously, I guess is what I want to hammer home. All right, so we're basically on the precipice of the core idea of the apocritic model, because what we think is happening when you criticize a pursuit, and particularly in this contrastive kind of spirit, what you're saying is this pursuit instead of that pursuit should have happened. And then there's got to be certain norms, obviously, governing pursuit if we're going to pursue this idea. And so the task then becomes articulating what we're going to call apocritic norms, that is, norms for pursuing questions or answering questions, in order to further unpack what's happening with these sorts of contrastive criticisms. Now, before we do this, let me just offer a word of caution, right? We are not going to be offering an all things considered account of criticisms or apocritic norms. What we're going to be giving is what are called pro tanto accounts of these things, right? And what I mean by pro tanto is what you'll get with this criticism is a consideration for why you should or should not pursue something. But what you won't be getting is an all things considered judgment of these things. So they can be overturned by further considerations. Let me give you just a brief example of this. We'll return to this example a bit later. So suppose quite reasonably that bacteriologists should search for bacterial causes of a given disease, right? We might think that that's grounded in a kind of apocritic obligation that bacteriologists have, right? But imagine, if you will, that there's a really nasty virus out there, right, that's causing a pandemic, right? The CDC may say all hands on deck, right? At that point, you aren't going to criticize the bacteriologist, right, for failing to pursue questions about bacterial causes, because there's a more pressing concern that overrides that criticism. Now, I wish we had a story about how to weight all these different considerations, but we're just trying to start the conversation here. And we hope minimally what we do is we start to give you a laundry list of the kinds of things that might go into an all things considered judgment. But we're mostly focused on pro tanto criticisms and what follows. So don't think of these as final verdicts on whether we should or shouldn't pursue things, but think of these as considerations for pursuing something or not pursuing something and what follows. One more caveat, we're going to focus chiefly on apocritic obligations and prohibitions. This is because we think that most of the norms actually in science end up being apocritic permissions. And so it's going to be a very, very wide field if we did that. We're going to focus on these, and you can sort of imagine that much of the rest of what's going on is permitted. I think you'll also be able to infer certain kinds of apocritic permissions given the contrastive machinery that we have going on. All right, so let's take a look and try to get a sense of what an apocritic obligation is. Right? And so here is what we think of as a paradigmatic way of expressing an apocritic obligation, right? Which, once again, is just the idea that some scientists should pursue a particular kind of question, right? That's the core idea behind an apocritic obligation. But we've added a few levers here which are going to be useful in what follows, right? So there's going to be an object of study that has a certain property which we call a feature when it grounds an apocritic obligation, right? And that then obligates scientists, right, with certain kinds of capabilities, that is, certain kinds of skills or specializations, right, to pursue a certain kind of question about that object of study. Now, don't worry about any of the letters. Those aren't so important. Just focus on the terms object of study, feature, capability, and question, right? And let's give you an example. So suppose there's a disease that we don't know much about, but we find that patients are responsive to antibiotics, right? Well, we know that when you have a antibiotic responsive disease, right, that there's likely a bacterial cause behind it. So at that point, it seems like there would be a pro tanto apocritic obligation for some bacteriologists to pursue the question, which bacteria causes the disease, right? So in terms of the framework that we had on the previous slide, the disease is the object of study. Responsiveness to antibiotics is your feature, right? Specialization or competency in bacteriology, right, is your capability. And obviously, the question is which bacteria causes the disease. Now we'll look at apocritic prohibitions, right? And these have a very similar structure, except you're prohibiting scientists from pursuing certain kinds of questions. And what you'll notice is, once again, there's an object of study, but instead of there being a feature, there's a bug. And this is a property of the object of study that basically triggers the prohibition. We don't typically need to talk about capabilities when we talk about apocritic prohibitions, though sometimes we do. That would be sort of an extension of what we're doing, but they tend to be more sweeping in the cases that we're going to look at. Now, let's give ourselves another toy example just to get a feel for these things. Imagine that there's a neural mechanism and some neuroscientist is hot to trot to figure out more about that neural mechanism. But the problem is the experiment they've designed, right, causes unnecessary harm to mice. In that case, you might imagine that the IACUC puts the kibosh on the pursuit, right, is the idea. And this is expressed by an apocritic prohibition, where the object of study is the experiment. We can also make it the neural mechanism, though it's a little bit more unwieldy. The bug is clearly causing unnecessary harm to mice, right? And the question is, what happens to mice in this experiment, right? Okay, so hopefully you're just starting to get a feel for the apocritic model. What I want to point out is even the sort of skeletal presentation allows us to do a little bit more with these kinds of contrastive criticisms. Now that we have a better sense of the kinds of considerations or ingredients that go into these apocritic norms, we can start to make more nuanced contrastive criticisms already, where basically different levers in these apocritic norms serve as different contrastive foci, right? So let me give you some toy examples for now, and then we'll look at some more realistic examples a little bit later in the talk. Let's go back to our bacteriology example, but just vary it a bit. Let's suppose that there are two diseases that are relatively unknown, and both of them are responsive to antibiotics, right? We'll call one disease X and one disease Y. Now imagine that the bacteriologists just put all of their efforts, right, into pursuing the bacterial causes of disease Y, but disease Y, it turns out, is far less lethal and far less contagious than disease X. That would clearly be grounds for a criticism, what we like to call an apocriticism when we're feeling cute. Basically the complaint is like, why are you only looking at the causes of disease Y when disease X is so much more urgent, right, is the idea behind it. What's happening here is the bacteriologists are asking the right question, but are about the wrong object of study, right? So the object of study ends up being the contrastive focus in this case, right? But we can also have a scenario, right, where it's the exact opposite, where they're asking the wrong question about the right object of study, right? And so this one is going to be a little bit more fanciful, but once again, this is just supposed to be the intuition pump, right? Imagine, right, that once again, we have an antibiotic responsive disease. And for whatever reason, let's suppose that there's some corruption or perverse funding incentives in place or something like that. The bacteriologists say just like, now we're gonna look at viral causes of the disease, right? Clearly that's grounds for a criticism. Why are you focused so much on the viral causes of the disease when we have good evidence that bacteria causes the disease, right? In this case, what we have is a case in which as I said, the focus is on the questions rather than the object of study. Right? The object of study is the right one, it's the disease. Yeah. And finally, we'll point to a third one, and I'll just sort of say there are other contrastive criticisms that you can get from the apocritic model. Here we imagine, once again, maybe some perverse funding incentives or some corruption or something like that. But for whatever reason, we have an antibiotic responsive disease, which would naturally be a thing for bacteriologists to then pursue the bacterial causes of the disease, but virologists end up doing it. Right? We say, like, why is it that these people who aren't specialists in hunting down bacterial causes are the ones who are pursuing the question, right? And so this might be another way in which this happens. Now, as I said, these are all toy examples, just designed to sort of show you the kinds of distinctions that we can already get on the basis of the first pass at the apocritic model. Okay, so at this point, what I want to do is dig deeper into some of the core concepts of the apocritic model, starting with features. I'll also look at bugs and capabilities, right? And what I want to show is that there's a variety of features in bugs, and we're going to focus on just two kinds, but I think there's several more. We're going to focus on epistemic and moral features, and ditto with bugs. But I just want to hammer home there are, of course, economic features in bugs. There may be political features in bugs. There may even be rhetorical or communicative features in bugs. These are all things that we hope either we or someone else takes up in future research. So let's start off with epistemic features. Right? And just to remind you, epistemic features are properties of an object of study that basically trigger apocritic obligations, trigger obligations to pursue certain kinds of questions. What we first want to do is try to figure out which subset of these features are epistemic. And here's what we'll sort of take as our first pass of what's going on. This is sort of the general structure of an epistemic feature as it figures in an apocritic obligation. You have an object of study, and if upon being justified, it would promote some epistemic good, right? Then some scientists with capabilities, C, should pursue that questions about that object of study. Two things to note about this, right? First, note the subjunctive structure of what's going on, right? There's going to be a certain forward-looking aspect to features because you're in the context of pursuit, right? You haven't yet seized upon those epistemic goodies. You're hoping to make yourself, put yourself in a position to do that, right? So that's why there's a subjunctive flavor to it, right? Note that the fulcrum here is upon being justified, which ends up being important, right? And in general, what features will have is a sort of interesting, if justified, kind of structure to them, right? The reason why we focus on justification instead of truth is because we think that's actually a little bit closer to the kinds of prescriptions you're going to get in apocritic norms. And what they do in particular is they give you better guidance about the kinds of questions you're going to ask, right? What you're going to do is you're basically going to ask questions that justify something about your object of study. Let me also say justification is supposed to be an umbrella term that can be filled in more precisely depending on what your object of study is. So if your object of study, for instance, is a measurement procedure, you'll probably be talking about calibration rather than justification writ large, just as an example. If you have a very, very specific object of study, then obviously you can point to very, very specific evidence that you would need to get. So as I said, this is sort of the most general formulation of what an epistemic feature is. We're going to focus in particular on coherence as the epistemic good that scientists are searching after, right? That sort of drives the epistemic feature. Why do we do this? Well, it seems to do a nice job of unifying previous work on pursuit, which is almost entirely about epistemic features, if you want to use our language. It's sometimes called indices of theory promise and things like that. Now, once again, I just want to hammer home, we have a general account that isn't restricted to theories. And one thing that's nice about this, for instance, is you could see how, for instance, developing an instrument, right, which upon being established as reliable, right, might increase the coherence of our current stock of knowledge. So that's just one of the things that you get by going to a more question-based approach to pursuit. And what you can see is this works out pretty nicely with our toy example of a bacteria, right? When you think about it, originally the way we characterized the epistemic feature was responsiveness to antibiotics, right? And what you notice is then if you pursue a question about a bacterial cause, you end up increasing the coherence of what's going on, right? Bacterial causes of diseases coheres really well with everything that we know about antibiotics. That's the idea. So you can see that it's got some initial plausibility. Right. Next, let's talk about moral features. And what you'll see is the structure of moral features is quite similar to epistemic features. It's just that instead of promoting some epistemic good, we instead promote some moral good. And in particular, just to give you an example that will figure prominently in at least two of our examples, it's not uncommon in biomedical research, right, for the promotion of better health outcomes to be a moral feature that you're trying to get. So in this case, we decided to use a hypothesis. What you notice is the moral good is promoting better health outcomes, as I said. And note that the question is pretty naturally glossed as a question about justification, as we said before. But just to hammer home, right, the common structure here is that interesting if justified kind of structure with an epistemic feature and a moral feature. So we think that this is likely to be a common feature of all features, if I can put it that way. All right, so let's turn now to our example from the NIH involving sex as a biological variable. And think about what this tells us, right? This one is sort of just an easy breezy example. It works out tidily. But if we think about something that might be an apocriticism, right? We end up with something along the following lines, particularly in that first stage of considering, right, and designing, right, studies that take sex into account, right? It might be that in certain kinds of grant proposals, someone raises the following criticism. Biomedical researchers, right, or the grant applicant perhaps, should pursue questions that include rather than exclude sex as a biological variable. It might be the kind of thing that we have in mind. Note that this is going to be a pro tanto criticism even by the standards of the NIH and the protocol that they have, right? You're allowed to explain why you're not including sex as a biological variable if there are overriding reasons to do so. But more interesting are the rationales they give for having such explicit protocols for sex as a biological variable. They cite both epistemic features and moral features, right? So they say one reason to include sex as a biological variable is that it will make the studies more generalizable because obviously you'll be incorporating more of the population when you do that. Furthermore, it promotes rigor insofar as you have a further control in your study. And finally, of course, it will promote better health because it's also generalizable. Right? Now, the main point I want to hammer home about this is just that apokritic obligations tend to be overdetermined because scientists are pursuing are pursuing an object of study that has lots of features, right? That basically there's going to be lots of epistemic features and moral features, and we shouldn't think of this as a case where there's any real competition between epistemic and moral kinds of considerations in science. Nothing terribly surprising there in the discussions of pursuit, but just worth hammering home. Right? But things get more interesting when we turn to bugs. Right? And what you'll see, they get more complicated in interesting ways. Right? So once again, we'll look at epistemic and moral bugs. As before, there are other kinds of bugs that we won't discuss. But let's take a look at these. Right? And starting with epistemic bugs. Now, what you might think of right off the bat, if you're thinking of like how to formulate an epistemic bug, is what I like to call the evil twin hypothesis, that basically epistemic bugs are just like epistemic features, but instead, if upon being justified, they would decrease the coherence of our current stock of scientific knowledge. And I want to tell you that this is a really bad notion of epistemic bugs, right? Why is that? Well, because actually, if we had something which, upon being justified, would decrease the coherence of our current stock of knowledge, that's a great stress test, right, on our received ideas, right? That's exactly the kind of thing you should be pursuing. Remember, we started off saying science, right? Criticism is a staple of the scientific enterprise, right? So this actually seems like a really interesting thing if justified, right? So this doesn't seem to me to be the right account of epistemic bugs, right? So what I'm going to suggest instead is that there's got to be at least three conditions, arguably two because we're giving pro tanto accounts of apokritic prohibitions, but I think three really clinches it. So let's talk through those three conditions. The first is that your object of study has to have a long track record of incoherence with our current stock of knowledge, right? That by itself is not going to be sufficient for at least the reason that it may have a long track record of incoherence, but it still might be the most coherent thing that we have. And so we should go with that, right? So you're going to need at least another condition, right? That there's an alternative which has a long track record of coherence, right? So this might be the case, for instance, with a geocentric conception of the universe or phlogiston. Don't tell Hasek Cheng I said that, right? But we still think that that's not enough, right? Even if it turns out that your object of study has a long track record of incoherence when compared to an alternative, it still may be that you're putting it to a new application, right? And it's finally going to have its day in the sun, right? And so you need to go even further and to issue an apokritic prohibition, we think, and require that the question presupposes this highly incoherent object of study, right? So what do I mean by a presupposition? It's a statement that any direct answer to that question entails. So for instance, if we ask, who drank all the whiskey? You'll note that any answer to that entails that someone drank all the whiskey. So if Matt drank all the whiskey, then someone drank all the whiskey. If I drank all the whiskey, then somebody drank all the whiskey, right? If Heather Douglas drank all the whiskey, the most likely result, I think, right? Most likely answer, then someone drank all the whiskey. Just kidding, Heather. So we think that then you have at least a pro tanto apokritic prohibition. You can say, like, nobody should be pursuing this question right now until some other considerations come in to weigh things out. Now, one thing I want to hammer home, because epistemic bugs are, I think, my favorite part of this story, right, is it's a pretty big uphill slog to establish that something is an epistemic bug, right? And this will be important in what follows, right? So epistemic bugs seem really complicated. Moral bugs, by comparison, seem very simple, right? We think that this is basically a pretty good account of a moral bug, right? If the object of study would cause a significant moral harm, then no scientist should pursue certain questions about that object of study. Note that this doesn't have the interesting if justified structure, right? It doesn't need to be justified in order to be something that you prohibit. It's just enough that it causes a significant moral harm, right? And I think you can see this really easily with our example of the mouse, right? So the experiment would cause unnecessary harm to mice, right? It doesn't matter if the experiment's well designed or not, right? The harm to the mouse is sufficient for Iacocca to say nope, right? And so we think that that's an interesting difference that moral bugs have with some of these other features and bugs that we've looked at. So just to take stock of where we're at right now, right? We see that basically epistemic and moral features have this interesting if justified structure, right? Bugs just have the would harm and that's sufficient, right? Moral bugs have the simple subjunctive structure that it just would harm and that's sufficient to trigger the prohibition. But epistemic bugs have this more complicated set of moving parts where there's a comparative track record and the object of study is less coherent compared to its alternative, and furthermore is presupposed in the question being pursued, and that's when you can trigger a prohibition. Now, here's just a thought I've had. This is half-baked, but I think like one reason why there's a bigger uphill slog with epistemic bugs in many cases is partly because when the only concerns are epistemic, you don't really want to put a kibosh because you never know how creative scientists will be in working through or debugging, right, what's going on. This is, I think, of a piece broadly with the autonomy of science, but I haven't really worked out that connection very well, right? Okay, so now let's go back to our case studies, right? And let's think about what I want to hammer home with this is the context, the arena, as I called it before, really does give you some hint about what's going on in terms of whether there's a moral feature or an epistemic bug or what have you there. So if we think about shaping research agendas, and we think in particular about this example, you might think that what happens in a lot of these cases is there's damning methodological criticisms that are highlighting, right, all the epistemic bugs, right, that are going on in the status quo. And in fact, it turns out that in many cases, this isn't how it works at all. And I'll try to explain why in a second. Right, but just to remind you, right, the intervention and the field that's being called for in this essay is to basically shift one's focus from what they call, actually, let me just put the next slide on. The criticism is going to be something like this, right? That epidemiologists should pursue a question whose answers provide information about what they call consequential rather than inconsequential interventions, right? Now, this could look like an epistemic, that they're highlighting an epistemic bug, because what they point to in these cases is basically there's a lot of focus on a small number of causal factors that have a small effect size, right? And so that has the flavor of sounding like it's trying to build the case for an epistemic bug. But note, if you're trying to change the research agenda, you're not going to satisfy our criteria for an epistemic bug very easily. The status quo ends up being the status quo generally because it's got a decent track record of coherence, often the best one relative to the alternatives. And so that's not necessarily the best way to reshape a research agenda, right? So we don't think that that's what's going on. And we think that instead what they're doing is they're highlighting the ways in which this epidemiology of consequence, where you're looking at more complex causal structures that have larger causal effects, larger effect sizes, excuse me, basically realize one of the moral features that epidemiologists are after, which is basically to figure out things that can positively affect population health and guide public health stakeholders, right? And so what might look like a methodological or epistemic criticism of a pursuit might in fact be motivated by something quite different. And in particular, this distinction between features and bugs ends up being rather important for understanding where the force of the criticism is coming from. Okay. I do want to give you a genuine case of an epistemic bug, and I think the neurosexism example does a pretty nice job with this. Right? Now, we'll get into some of the details in a second, but here's something like the criticism going on, right? Neuroscientists should have pursued questions that do not presuppose, rather than presupposed, hardwired sexual dimorphism in brains when explaining, right, observed patterns of behavior. Right? Now, if you look at the way that this works, there clearly is a moral bug that they're highlighting, that it reinforces pernicious gender stereotypes. Right? And the way that I want to think about this is sort of what pulls scientists out of the lab and into the public is the moral bug, right? But once you get into the public sphere, the moral arguments coming from scientists are often no better than any other citizens, right? Where scientists have authority is on the epistemic stuff. And so what they're going to do is then highlight the epistemic bug with the hardwired hypothesis, right? And this is what you see in a lot of these public-facing documents involving neurosexism, right? So the questions might be, what hardwired biological sex difference explains a certain pattern of behavior? And what they point out is that this actually has a very bad track record, the presupposition of that question, right? The hardwired hypothesis, as I like to call it, right? And they point to at least 3 criticisms in the literature, right? The first is just that the phenomenon to be explained, these different patterns of behavior that somehow track with sex differences, is actually not a pattern that you see much of, right? So scores obtained from groups of females and males substantially overlap on the majority of social, cognitive, and personality variables that you see. So the explanandum itself is not even an explanandum that we're going to see in a lot of studies, is at least part of the claim. But also, right, it turns out that the major presupposition of the hardwired hypothesis is also not very well supported by neuroanatomy. There's what they call mosaicism about brains, right? There's not the male and the female brain. At best, there's certain statistical associations you see with certain regions of the brain, right? But even then, the fact that someone has, say, a quote-unquote female amygdala is a very bad predictor of what's going to be happening in the rest of their brain. There's tons of individual differences across different brains, and so it doesn't make sense to talk about a male brain and a female brain at all, right? Third, the thing they point to is the explanatory power of the hardwired hypothesis is not very strong. And the reason for this is because the kinds of behavioral differences that we occasionally see have multiple causes that are at different scales, everything from genes to social structures to behaviors in brains and stuff like that in between. And furthermore, it's not that there's a nice sort of top-bottom kind of reductive story that's going on. There's lots of interaction effects and entanglements between the different things. So a social structure might affect brain structure, just to give one example, but of course a brain structure can also affect social structure, right? So none of this works out very well for the hardwired hypothesis. And what they're basically showing is that this track record doesn't work very well. The alternative is basically to treat these things as modular in different kinds of ways that are suggested by the overlap of behavioral variables and mosaicism and the sort of interactive and entangled causal structure that's proposed. Right? I'll kind of wrap up by talking a bit about capabilities which were sort of unique to apokritic obligations. And if you remember, these are basically sort of the skill sets that sort of say, you're the kind of person who should be, you're the kind of scientist who should be pursuing this question. That's the general idea behind them. So what you might have noticed with many of my examples is they involve sort of specialists in different kinds of fields like bacteriology, neuroscience, biomedical research, epidemiology, and so on and so forth. And we think at least one useful framework, though perhaps not the only one to think about, is the classic Darden-Mall account of fields. And I'll just briefly sort of summarize what that is and then explain why we think it's well suited for what we're doing. right? So Darden and Mall define a field as comprised of a central problem, a domain consisting of items taken to be facts related to that problem, general explanatory factors and goals providing expectations as to how the problem is to be solved, techniques and methods, and sometimes, but not always, concepts, laws, and theories which are related to the problem and which attempt to realize the explanatory goals, and often a special vocabulary. Right? So the thing I want to hammer home about that is I said problem a lot in that. That's basically the thing you have to gather from this. And note, a question to be answered is a problem to be solved. Right? And so if you have specific problems that specific people are supposed to solve, you're going to have specific questions, we think, that they're going to need to answer. And that's why there's a nice fit between the Darden Mall account of fields and capabilities as we're imagining them. Now, one thing to keep in mind about this is when everyone has a clear job description, that's often really helpful for having an efficient division of labor, but that comes with a certain kind of cost, right? But the reason why it's efficient, of course, is we don't replicate efforts across the scientific community in ways that are not helpful, right? And people are going to have greater specialization in learning how to tackle the problem specific to those questions. That's the rough idea behind it. But there is a cost to this, and that's what you might think of as silo thinking, right? I think there's lots of things to be said about this, but one of the most obvious thing is if I'm tasked with just certain kinds of questions that I'm especially well equipped to answer, there's going to be other questions that I don't think of. And if everyone does this, there's going to be particular questions that might slip through the cracks, right? And so capabilities can't just be a function of fields, right? If we're going to try and avoid that, we have to have different kinds of apocritic norms, and in particular, apocritic obligations. So some of these we think are just going to be slightly more general. It's going to be like, I don't care which field you're at, but some of you who have reliable methods for answering this question should do so, right? And this is going to be one way in which you can break through fields, right? And then there might be some interesting incentive structures for who gets to sort of tackle those questions. Maybe because it's a new question, it ends up being there's sort of a credit economy kind of explanation you might be able to give. We'll sort of remain open about that for now. Right? But one thing that these field independent norms might do is they might foster interdisciplinary collaboration, right? We might recognize also, well, nobody's really in a position to provide a good answer to this question, but it's an important question to answer. Maybe if we team up, we can tackle this. And I'll sort of illustrate that this might be what's going on in one of the nice articles beating up on neurosexism, right? Where they're sort of saying, like, what would it mean to have a good neuroimaging methodology given what we know about sex and gender? And if you look at the specializations of the collaborators, you can see that they're quite varied, right? So there's Rippin, who's essentially a neuroscientist in the psychology department, Jordan Young, who's in women's gender and sexuality studies, Kaiser, who's a social psychologist, and Cordelia Fine, who kind of does everything, right? Neuroscience, business school, and the Center for Ethical Leadership. Right? And so what you might think is that you need all of these different skill sets, which come from different fields, in order to have to realize a general norm such as this one, right? That we should have a reliable way of answering certain kinds of questions. In this case, how to properly neuroimage sex and gender differences, for instance, or similarities, I should say. We think there's another way in which fields will not always be driving the capabilities, that is, the skill sets needed to pursue questions. And that's by appealing to standpoint theory, right? Which for the purposes of today, I'll define according to the following 4 theses, right? The claim that is, first of all, that knowledge is socially situated. Second, that marginalized groups are socially situated in ways that make certain evidence and questions more salient to them than non-marginalized groups. Third, right, that sort of epistemic advantage that marginalized groups have is an achievement and not an automatic epistemic privilege, right? So simply in virtue of being a person of color, that doesn't mean that you're an authority on, say, ethnic or racial inequalities, right? It happens from having vigilance that you're more likely to have in virtue of being a person of color, right? And then finally, that research focused on power relations should begin with the standpoint or lives of the marginalized, right? So one thing that I think is particularly interesting when we think about the neurosexism case and think about its interaction with fields is this idea that standpoints are achievements, right? Because what you start to see is that In the context of science, achieving a standpoint often requires, once again, interdisciplinary collaboration. So I was really struck by this this quote that I should say that Marina pulled up, which really points to the importance of standpoint. And what you might think of is that you need all of these different fields in order to have a standpoint that would be something like a feminist neuroscientist kind of standpoint in this case, right? What they say is, unless neuroscientists have specific expertise or knowledge in gender scholarship, they too are lay people with respect to gender research, may also be susceptible to gender essentialist thinking. Right? So the thought is we're going to have a bunch of different capabilities, some of which are institutionalized in fields and some of which are not. And standpoints are one way to do this. General epistemic norms or apokritic norms might be another way to do this. And I suspect there's many more when we think about it. So with that, I'll just wrap up with the take-home lessons. First, we think there's at least 3 arenas for pursuit-based criticism. Just to remind you, these are funding decisions, shaping scientific research agendas, and the public accountability of scientists. Furthermore, we think pursuit-based criticism is grounded. Maybe that's too strong, but you can clarify what pursuit-based criticism is by looking at breaches of obligations and prohibitions to answer questions, what we call apokritic norms. Right? And those norms in turn can be explicated in terms of things like features, bugs, and capabilities of inquirers. And this seems to be an interesting way of synthesizing a bunch of disparate threads in the philosophy of science involving pursuit, science and values, social epistemology, and standpoint theory. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you so much, Kareem. Wonderful. So there are 2 mechanisms for asking a question. Either you can hover over your name in the list of participants, which if the list of participants is not up, you can bring it up with the bottom right hand button. And yes, Heather's just done it. You hover over your name and then you click the hand and you raise your hand, or you can just type a question into the chat and we'll be keeping an eye on the chat. So it looks like we already have 2 hands. So first I will call on Devin. And then I can give you permission to unmute, but you have to unmute yourself is another part of the thing here. So Devin, you still have to unmute yourself. Okay, I'm going to come back to you, Devin.
Okay, there we go.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Tessie. Okay, so yeah, that was a really interesting perspective on the increasing bias, or the bias in medicine that sort of became more prevalent when these studies were shown about like the science, the picking of the questions, but sort of to try, I may be overgeneralizing this. Sort of what I understood from the lecture is that the what you're proposing is to avoid the loaded questions that come with the inference stage, inference or hypothesis stage in the scientific process. Is that sort of correct? Is that you're targeting specifically loaded questions?
Loaded questions, I think that comes up most in the context of what I called epistemic bugs, where you just have something that has a really bad track record and you presuppose its truth in the question. So that would be the case where that pops up. That's not always going to be a problem. Obviously, in many cases, you have to presuppose certain things about successful science in order to move it along in your questions.
Okay, Heather?
This is a fun system. I wanted to ask about the entanglement of epistemic and moral issues. So the areas where I have seen both philosophers of science and scientists debate issues of pursuit most recently is in terms of gain of function research and virology. So this is when you take a virus and you make it more dangerous deliberately. super fun. And this particularly came up with H5N1 about 10 years ago, which is a virus that could kill half the population if it became transmissible in humans. And there was a big debate among virologists, like, should we in labs make viruses more dangerous? You could say, obviously there's a potential for significant moral harm. If that thing escapes, wow, big problem. If you publish the exact genetic sequence, which they did with H5N1 and in the more transmissible form, and someone decides to actually wipe out half humanity, you've just handed them the tool, because CRISPR, we can do this, mail order bits of DNA, we can do this readily. But the scientists say, but we need to know what the possibilities are for these viruses. They mutate on their own. They're doing this already. We need to know how to monitor wild type variations and look out for the more dangerous variations. So the moral and epistemic get really naughty, right? And that's why, like, I think philosophers like Don Howard has written about this, and he's like, think it's great. I'm sort of like, I don't know. But there's a big debate, and I was just wondering how an apokritic approach would tackle that kind of thorny nest of issues.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be the cop-out answer is I'm only giving you pro tanto criticism, so I don't have to answer this question just yet. But I think the general thought is going to be what are the pursuit worthiness features of it, and what are the whether those are moral or epistemic. And then what are the bugs, and how you weight those things. It really is. I am just going to punt on this question. I'm realizing this as I talk to you. It's just going to be like a cost benefit analysis, I think, is ultimately what you're going to have to say. Not in the strict sense, but like you're going to have to weigh your epistemic features and your epistemic bugs. Yeah, I saw you gasp as I said cost benefit analysis. No, what I mean is you're going to have to sort of weigh those things out. What I like about approaching things maybe more deontically is there's a sense in which a criticism is levied, and it's not just like, hey, this thing has a numeric value that's greater, right? It's actually, you have to think about a response to the criticism. And so one thing we'd really like to be able to do in future research is to try and sort of figure out more of, I don't know how to describe it exactly, the sort of criticism and response mechanisms that would happen in a sort of optimal kind of debate about pursuit. That would be a neat thing to do. We don't quite know how to do that yet, but yeah, I think I'd probably want to go a more procedural route and think about criticism and response about those sorts of things. But you need to have an account of criticisms first, which is what we're trying to do.
So I was thinking you could look at the debate over gain of function research to look at the way in which criticism responses were in fact made in the scientific community. That the National Safety Board on Biosecurity had extensive discussions. They first said don't publish the details, and they reversed the decision. That there's like a really nice history from the first half of the last decade that you could look at to see, like, is this following norms or not?
Okay, that's very helpful. I hope you enjoyed your whiskey.
Okay, Paul.
I haven't received any yet.
A little latency there. Yes. Paul, please.
Oh, that's my fault.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm wondering, how does uncertainty figure in all of this? Let's say that you have a group of, let's say you think bacteria A probably causes the disease, and there's a small subset of biologists that are studying B, and they turn out to be right. Or consider Copernicus. At the time he published, the Aristotelian community of the day would have said this is not worth pursuing because it violates established physics, that the Earth can't possibly be moving because it would violate Aristotelian physics. So how do you allow for uncertainty? Also, the same thing in ethical things, that maybe if we think that there probably aren't hardwired gender differences in behavior, why not let the people that do think that pursue it, and if they fail, that'll strengthen the evidence that there's no such thing.
Yeah, good. So yeah, one thing we've done with this sort of simplified account of apocritic norms is we haven't talked about some of the ways in which there can be degreed concepts going on. So we put it sort of like some bacteriologists should, pursue this question. And the obvious contrast to that would be no bacteriologist should pursue the question. There's no reason why apocritic norms can't start to have more nuanced kind of quantifiers with them, right? So you might say like more bacteriologists should be pursuing these questions, but that doesn't preclude others from not pursuing it. So that's, I think, generally how I'd want to try and capture that. And that's, I think, a natural handshake between the more dominant kind of consequentialist kinds of and decision theoretic kinds of analyses you see in certain literatures on pursuit, with a more deontic analysis that we're giving. But the idea would be that a lot of the decision theoretic vocabulary and concepts could be embedded in those apocritic norms to give us more nuanced kinds of apocritic norms.
Thanks.
Thank you. That's a great question.
Okay, Santuja. Oh.
Okay, there we go. Can you hear me?
I can. Hey, Sanjuja.
Hey, that was great. Thank you so much. I was wondering, when we were talking about things like moral bugs and moral features, are you approaching that with some prior conception of morality? Is it primarily utilitarian considerations here, or it's just and I guess relatedly, when you were talking about unnecessary harm to the mouse, what counts as necessary versus unnecessary?
Yes, great questions. I guess what I would say is I'm trying not to presuppose anything about morality when I offer these norms. I think one hopefully in many cases that it won't matter, that basically your normative theory will basically give you the same sorts of prescriptions about what's a moral feature and what's a moral bug. How one would specify unnecessary, I think, is at least in the mouse case, is probably going to be partly a function of Iacocca protocols and things like that. But that's obviously not going to be ingrained in the fabric of morality, Iacocca protocols. I don't have a great story about that myself. My colleagues basically keep me away from doing any kind of teaching of ethics because they can tell I'm despicable, I guess is what I would say.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, good. Right. That was the last hand in our queue. Oh, no, two more hands have come up. So, Jamie, go ahead.
Oh, I have plenty of time to ask Kareem these questions. The other person can go first. It's fine.
All right. Regina.
I was hesitating to ask because it's really more of a clarificatory question that I have. I had to step away for a minute, so I think that's why I'm confused. But when I came back, you were talking a little bit more about standpoint theory, and you had that example nicely of this collaborative effort between people of all sorts of different departments coming together and kind of having a variety of standpoints involved in answering certain questions about the neurosexism stuff. But I was actually confused how that connected to the earlier parts of the talk, and I was hoping maybe you could just run through it again for me.
Sure. So if you remember when we talked about obligations to pursue, what we called apocritic obligations, one of the parameters in that is having a capability so that the right sorts of people are pursuing the questions, right? So we want bacteriologists pursuing questions about bacterial causes, right? Now, when it comes to combating neurosexism, it's not just enough to be a neuroscientist, right? I think you have to be, if I can call you a neurofeminist, right? And in the literature on standpoint theory, they often talk about achieving a standpoint, right? But generally what we have in mind are, social categories as basically the loci of standpoints. But when you're in a scientific context, it's not just enough to be a feminist. You have to be a neurofeminist if you want to say something about neuroimaging. And that's where I think that's another occasion where a question might fall through the cracks, right? If you're just thinking about it in terms of fields. And so the need to achieve a standpoint is actually what causes scientists from different fields to join forces. So it's a collective achievement that I think is maybe a slightly different way than I don't know a ton about the standpoint literature. I'm not a connoisseur or anything, but it seems to me like that's something that maybe hasn't been brought up as much as how standpoints are achieved in the context of pursuit. Thank you for allowing me to probably clarify that in my own head better. So I really appreciate that.
Okay, Jamie.
Right. Thanks, Graham. I think this is a bit of a softball, but I was wondering if for features at least, and possibly for bugs, are you thinking that something is always going to be a feature, or is it going to be a feature in some contexts and bugs in other contexts? I was specifically thinking about theoretical virtues, these debates about, sometimes simplicity is wonderful, sometimes complexity is more desired or something like that.
Yeah. Certainly I'm going to be, it is a softball question. Yes, it's not going to be one size fits all. I think that's exactly right. What you might say, depending on how you, and this is actually of a piece with Paul's question, is you might actually have a view that simplicity is in fact always a feature for at least some segment of a scientific community, just because you want to promote a plurality of approaches to a question. So you might say like, well, actually simplicity always is, but it's not always going to be, it's going to be, let me put it this way. Simplicity, like here would be one way of going, I'm not committed to this, but this is just a way to sort of play devil's advocate with myself. Suppose you say something like simplicity is always going to be a feature for at least some subset of a scientific community. It's always going to be a good reason for someone to pursue, but not everyone needs to use simplicity to regard simplicity as a epistemic feature. So it's never that you could say, for instance, something like, well, look, you're trying to sort of decrease the number of adjustable parameters, right? In your theory, like, how dare you? You're prohibited from doing that. That seems to me like a strange thing to do. That might be the only thing I could think of, but I'm much more inclined to just go with what you were suggesting, which is it's not a one size fits all kind of thing. That seems like the much more intuitive one. I saw Heather asked if epistemic bugs are Lakatosian, and Jamie basically told me yes, it is Lakatosian. I hadn't really been thinking about it in those terms explicitly, but I think that's right.
Okay, Jan. Oh, let me hit the wrong button. There we go, Jan.
Yes, thanks. Okay, thank you, Khalifa. Thanks for the talk. So I think this question is similar to Jamie's question, because I was thinking about how these bugs and these features can actually relate somehow to evidence, because there is some point in which you have to admit that they're not, they have to depend somehow on evidence and how we get evidence. And something which was a feature can become a bug, and something that is a bug becomes a feature. You can think about history of science as people were questioning things as bugs, and in fact that were perfectly legitimate. So that's my question. How do you decide how stable a bug is, or how unstable is in time?
I think the only way to do that is probably by pursuing things and seeing what works out, at least in certain cases, right? So I don't know if there's an a priori answer to that question. So for instance, responsiveness to antibiotics, just to use the most concrete of bugs that I had, I think, in the talk. It's partly just that there's been a long track record, and there's a good understanding of how antibiotics basically affect bacterial diseases, right? That's part of it. So it's basically that coherence-based kind of reasoning that I had mentioned, at least in the epistemic case. Now, in the moral case, I think I don't know what to say in that case, because once again, they don't let me teach ethics at Middlebury. But I think in the epistemic case, it's mostly going to be the track record of coherence, which does some work on that. So yeah. But thank you for your question. It's a good one. But yeah, I think it is going to be something that requires further investigation.
Okay. Rowan says in the chat, I'm not familiar with the discussion in the pursuit literature, but as someone who has published this kind of apokritic criticism, agenda setting work, the most common critique I got was basically pursuit shouldn't be criticized, or more charitably, only the most dire and universally agreed upon moral bugs should constrain pursuit. Thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just going to pull that up in the chat so I can read it a little bit more carefully. So the thought is pursuit shouldn't be criticized. Well, I think once again, it depends on what the force of the criticism is, I think is my thought. There can be criticisms which are not knock down, drag out, criticism. They can be pro tanto. And I think my sense is that's good things to put on scientists' radars when it happens, right? It's a good idea to think to yourself like, okay, you have been doing things that way, but you're probably taking a lot for granted. And there might be a suggestive alternative worth looking at. And yes, one might think of that as a really sort of mild form of criticism, right? You're not like saying like, damn you to the flames for doing what you're doing or something like that. But it strikes me that you're highlighting certain shortcomings in the way things have been done. And that strikes me as good enough for calling it a criticism.
It seems like, so I'm going to take the privilege and ask a question. It seems like the account is mostly focused on the perspective of either an individual scientist deciding what to pursue, or an individual critic addressing a specific project. Although you did talk about agenda setting work, it's still kind of relatively narrow agendas. So I wonder if your account can accommodate the kinds of criticisms of pursuit that you see, for example, in Philip Kitcher's work, right? So where, the problem is really that of the whole gamut of medical research, 90% of it is on the diseases that rich people care about, and 10% is on the diseases that 90% of the world suffers from. And it's not that, any particular person doing research on male pattern baldness is doing something impermissible, but the sort of in the context of this whole, there's a whole social pattern of problematic prioritization. So I wonder, how does that fit into your theory? Do we need a second?
I think it will, and I think it's partly the answer that I gave to Paul, which is right now we just, and I think you're putting your finger on it too. It's just like, well, some bacteriologists should do this, and that implies that the contrast is no bacteriologist should do this other thing, right? But of course, you could have more bacteriologists should be focusing on something, and fewer should be focusing on this other thing. Would be another way of pursuing questions. That is, right? Would be just an extension, I think, of the kinds of apokritic norms that we have. We were trying to keep it simple just for purposes of presentation. But yes, I think that would be a natural way of enriching the vocabulary of these apokritic norms, is by getting into these more gradable notions of basically the amount of resources that you're allocating to different kinds of questions or pursuits. Yeah. Trying to think if that addresses everything in your question, because there was more in it, and I feel like I'm somehow not doing justice. I hadn't been thinking about this, I guess, so much. The individual critic thing, I think, is an interesting thing that I hadn't thought about. We had been thinking a lot about who gets to criticize, but we didn't actually have a place to weave that in without adding another epicycle. But I think something like the apokritic location, if I can call it that, is something important. We mentioned this briefly when we discuss standpoints in the paper that we're working on. But an interesting thought that that your question raises is, what does collective criticism look like? And I don't have a great answer to that, but that's a really great question.
Yeah. It's a little, it's a little hard also, because who bears the responsibility, right, for that? I mean, you look at the community and say more of you should be doing this and less of you should be doing that. Yeah. But there's a kind of, how do you kind of deal with the collective action issues there?
That's right. Yeah. And responsiveness to criticism, which of course is a term that has some currency in other corners, takes on a different valence, I think, in this, when talking about pursuit, right? Because it's generally not just about the scientists responding to the criticism, but in fact requires bigger institutional and organizational changes, particularly when you're talking about these big systematic structural problems with pursuits. I think that's exactly right.
Heather reminds us that the 2017 AAAS statement on scientific freedom and responsibility creates a ground for criticizing pursuits in science. I think that's absolutely right, and a good thing for everyone. If you've never read that statement, you should look it up.
Good. Thank you.
The entire board of AAAS approved it, so it's it's a very interesting phenomenon. If there are no more questions, we're getting close to the end of our time, but we might be able to fit one more in. Going once. Okay, going twice. All right. Well, you answered all the questions and solved all the problems, Kareem. So you get 2 extra minutes off. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your lecture, Kareem. It was really great. Really enjoyed it. And I look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks here. We'll be having another lecture by Keisha Ray. So not next Friday, but the Friday after that.
Wonderful.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for your feedback. I really appreciate it. And it's a real honor to workshop ideas about science and values at a center dedicated to precisely that. So thank you to Matt and the staff at the center for making that possible.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Matt, should I stick around or should I go?
Yeah. Why don't you stick around?
Okay.
Me, guess my goodbye slide is just not going to come up.